Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker shills, debt slave service peasants, vassals, middle class. I'm useful idiot, and the information is in from the last US Census data, and what we find is that the middle class is at its lowest level, perhaps in US history. So what we have is 60% of US households earning between $20,000 and $101,000 a year collectively earn 46.6% of all income in the United States. That is a 1.5% drop. To give you some perspective, in 1990, the middle class shared 50% of all income. And in addition to this, the inequality is going up in this post-recession era, as the government calls it. And it's happening because the top is starting to pull away again, because the top percentage of Americans whose wages and assets and net worth are going up. And this is the income equality is at the highest level since 1967 and is at the worst level since 1917. So we're looking at 100 years of American history, and the American middle class is bottoming out. Just in case you had any doubts what was happening in America, the disappearance of the middle class, and this trajectory towards a very wealthy upper class in the United States, and a very vast poverty-stricken service sector of debt slaves. And that is America's future on our current trajectory. In 2007, 20%, and this is a good indication of just how devastating this so-called recession has been. In 2007, 20% of Americans had zero net worth. So, 20% of Americans 5 years ago had zero net worth. And now, 3 years after that, in 2010, 33% of Americans had zero net worth. So that's a gigantic increase in Americans moving from the middle class and moving into the lower classes in America. And in fact, according to the Pew Research Center, 32% of Americans now consider themselves lower class compared to 25% in 2008. So in a mere 4 years, we have another 10% of the American population now even considering themselves lower class. And in fact, here's another startling statistic. In 1971, 61% of Americans were considered middle income. And in 2011, 40 years later, 51% of Americans were considered middle income. So in other words, in 1971, in spite of the Vietnam War and in spite of a lot of economic calamity and recessionary times, even then, most Americans could be classified as middle class. But by the time we're several years into the so-called Great Recession, only half of Americans are now in the middle class as the lower classes swell and poverty comes to dominate America. And no surprise that this would be the case, because you look at American wages, and not only have they stagnated, but they are now retreating. And in spite of Ben Bernanke and the Federal Reserve's protests that inflation is under control, of course, Americans know when they go out there, the real costs of everything have been growing exponentially. And there's lots of ways that inflation is hidden. Just to show one little bit of anecdotal evidence, look at the fact that they don't count as inflation when all the products that you buy at the grocery store are the same price, but they come in a lot smaller packages. And that can make a big difference to a corporation's bottom line. So that's just one example. But this video is not about inflation, so I will move on from there. So here's a good example of why American middle class continues to struggle in spite of wage gains and some net worth gains over the last few decades. That is the fact that we are in a country now where the median income is around $50,000 a year. And that used to seem like a lot of money. But in our inflationary times and our stagnation times and the degradation of our currency, this is not going to go far, particularly because the demands on the modern American life are all things that cost money and whose prices and costs have been going up. So you take the median income of $50,000 a month, and that leaves $4,000 a month roughly. And after taxes, you have $3,000 a month. And $3,000 a month sounds fairly okay on paper. But if you're raising a family, obviously the difficulties become obvious. But let's go down a list. So of course the main expense is housing. And that now takes up half of most Americans' income, particularly now in the post-recessionary period. So half of that income, so we have $1,500 roughly, is the average going into housing. And you can make adjustments for people who rent and such. But the bottom line is that housing takes that big chunk. And then after that, we have the expense of energy. We have the expense of water. We have the expense of food. We have the expense of telephone. We have the expense of the internet. We have the expense of purchasing a vehicle. We have the expense of gasoline. We have the expense of vehicle repairs. We have the expense of car insurance. We have the expense of health insurance. We have the expense of dental bills. We have the expense of homeowners insurance. We have the expense of life insurance. We have the expense of student debt. We have the expense of credit cards. We have the expense of buying furniture. We have the expense of clothing. We have the expense of pets. We have the expense of property taxes. We have the expense of driver's licenses. It goes on and on and on. And of course, all these providers of all this food, energy, internet, when their costs rise, they pass their expenses on to the consumer. They have the option. It's very difficult for Americans to increase their income and to compensate for the rising cost of everything else. And since a lot of these companies, for example, internet and telephone, and have monopolies, they have the leeway to keep jacking their prices up in order to compensate for their supposed losses. But that's quite an extensive list of expenses that have to be covered by somewhere between $1,500 and $2,000 a month. And that is just the middle income Americans. Imagine the struggles of somebody who used to be in the middle income and now finds themselves in a lower income. Imagine having to sustain all of those things for them and their families when they move to a much lower income bracket. And then, of course, we also have to factor in the fact that there's a lot of families, not just individuals, who are living on $50,000 median a year, or $50,000 a month, or $40,000 a month, or $30,000 a month, which is still considered pretty good wages in the United States, and yet they have to afford all of these things. They have become necessities in an American culture. And then, of course, the bottom line is entertainment. And this is a double-edged sword because, of course, Americans have to afford all of these necessities and these apparent necessities, but they also spend a lot of money on entertainment. And that includes television, cable TV, their phones, movies, etc., and concerts. And somehow they still find the money to pour a lot of money into entertainment. So that provides kind of a subtext to the story that is a subject for another video. But so anyway, what we have here is the United States, the American dream, the American middle class is now at an all-time low. This is our recovery. This is the new normal. This is the new America. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.